Welcome to Module 1, Engagement Management, and Section 1.1, which is the pre-engagement activities. And pre-engagement activities are the foundation of any ethical hack campaign or penetration test. And essentially, these are the things like setting up the rules of the engagement. Rules of engagement. We have also the scope, things like the number of devices that can be attacked or the range of the IP addresses that can be attacked, the objectives that are to be accomplished or what we would like to accomplish, legal considerations, for example, compliance guidelines and regulations that apply to a given industry. So let's say you're in the health industry, you have to at the very least abide by HIPAA and the things that you would necessarily worry about if you accidentally leaked some information that you shouldn't have. A lot of things fall under the legal considerations, and then the methodologies that are allowed to be used throughout the campaign, throughout the engagement itself. So what can you do and what can you not do? How far can you go with your exercise and where should you stop, right? So all of these things are done inside of these pre-engagement activities that are done. And to have these pre-engagement rules and the scope and all of these things, it ensures that the testing is conducted ethically, legally, and in alignment with industry standards, and even further, in alignment with the company's guidelines and the requirements from the board of executives and the stakeholders and everybody else that's involved. To get the PenTest Plus notes, practice questions, and to join a supportive community of like-minded people like you, consider joining the Hackaholics Anonymous membership community. We have 4 tiers: the supporter, the agent, the guardian, and the master. And each tier gets their own Discord server and early access to content. The agent, guardian, and master levels will get exclusive content like line-by-line code explanations for how to create cybersecurity and PenTest Plus scripts, like exclusive downloads that they will get. For example, the notes document for this PenTest Plus and everything that I'm using for the lectures, as well as all of the practice questions and everything else that will go along that will be made for the scripts and everything else that we're going to be doing for the PenTest Plus training series. There will be free pre-made monthly Python automations that have to do with system administration, cybersecurity defense, as well as, of course, PenTest Plus and ethical hacking. And then there's going to be monthly live streams with me every single month, plus so many other things that you would get as a part of being a member of Hackaholics Anonymous in these tiers. To join, you can simply click the link in the description below, or you can go to our homepage and click the join button there. Or you can go to youtube.com/@HankHacksHackers/join, and you'll be able to join Hackaholics Anonymous. Now, without further ado, let us continue with PenTest Plus. All right, the first thing we need to do is we need to define scope. Now, the scope of a pen test determines what assets, systems, and data are included or excluded from testing. And it's critical to ensuring that a controlled and authorized assessment is ran while minimizing all of the risks. The assets and systems could be anything like a range of devices inside of a specific segment in the network that can be attacked. It could be the various IP addresses. It could be really anything that is the target, right? So the scope is the target. There's also the scope where it applies to the types of exercises or the types of tests or tactics and techniques that can be used, and that also technically falls under scope. But in this specific context, we're talking about the targets. Essentially, what are you going to target? What are you allowed to target? And what are you not allowed to target? You will most likely also be required to comply with various industry regulations and security frameworks based on the company, the industry that you're in, the assets that are being targeted, etc. These dictate the rules of engagement, data handling requirements, and reporting obligations, among other things. But those are the key elements of this. And this is, all of the stuff that it falls under the pre-engagement activity essentially sets up the rest of the test. So every single one of these things is very, very important, and you have to abide by these things. And extremely important, or especially more important, would be the things like the rules of engagement, data handling requirements, and reporting obligations, specifically in accordance to the regulations and compliance requirements of whatever industry that you're in. There are many regulations and compliance standards, and if you Google it, you'll find dozens, and a lot of them have to do with industry specific types of regulations and compliance. But there are some that apply pretty much across the board. So, for example, GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, was developed by the European Union, and it has to do with data privacy and protection. And data privacy and protection pretty much applies to every company that has data, which is pretty much every company. So it requires consent and notification before testing and protects personal data from unauthorized processing. And if you have a website, for example, you have to abide by GDPR, even if your website is not based out of Europe or your client base is not based out of Europe, just in case if somebody from Europe browses the internet and finds your website, you have to abide by the GDPR rules. So this is one of those things that is pretty much all encompassing. I would say this is like one of the few that applies to every single industry and every type of business, as especially if you have a website. If you have a website, you have to abide by GDPR rules. The next one would be HIPAA, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, and this is another really big one because it applies to everything and anything that has to do with healthcare. So there's something called PHI, which is the Protected Health Information, and this is ensuring that that information is safeguarded, that there's no accidental disclosure of that information during your penetration test. You don't accidentally alter the information or delete the information during the penetration test. And healthcare could be a hospital, it could be an insurance company, it could be just some random company that for whatever reason deals with somebody's health information, a pharmaceutical company. All of these things are required to abide by HIPAA rules and regulations. And it's mainly US based, but every country has their own version of this if they're not specifically using HIPAA. So this is, again, one of those things that if you're in healthcare or anything that has to do with healthcare, most likely you have to abide by this. The next one would be PCI and DSS, or PCI DSS, I should say, which is the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard. And this has to do with anybody who takes credit card information or payment card information. We should say it like that because it doesn't just narrow down to credit cards. It doesn't just apply to credit cards. It could be debit cards. It could be essentially any card that is used for payment. So a pen testing of systems that handle cardholder data, which is also known as requirement 11.3. So this is regular pen testing of systems that actually handle and process data information for credit cards. And testing has to be segregated from production payment systems, meaning it needs to be separate from actual payment systems that are live and taking payments from the customer base that's coming in, because you're not going to stop business just to run a penetration test. So it needs to be separate. The production environment is the live environment that's actually being used by customers, and that needs to be separate from the testing environment. So the best way to do this would be to create an exact duplicate of the production environment so you can test it and do whatever you want without having to worry about crashing or ruining anything that's going on inside of the live production environment. So if you collect payment card information, you have to do this and you have to abide by these standards. And it's one of the ones that requires regular scheduling of penetration tests because there have been massive companies, really large companies that have fallen victim to exploits and hacks that have taken place against their point of sale systems, their POS systems, and their payment card systems. And this is one of those things because if somebody gets into your system and steals credit card information data, they can technically use that credit card information to go ahead and use that person's credit card to make purchases and do a bunch of things that they should not be able to do, or they're not permitted to do. By the way, sorry about my dog barking in the background. I have no idea if you could hear her little squeaky barks, but I think the mail person, the Amazon person is here or something like that. So she kind of has these occasional little squeaks. So in case you hear that, that's what's going on. The next one, or the next series that we have, is the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, also known as SOX. And this has to do with public companies and financial audit. So essentially, if there's any kind of financial information and financial reporting, then you need to abide by Sarbanes-Oxley. And Sarbanes-Oxley, one of the big names, or one of the big industries that this applies to, has to do with banks, like publicly traded banks, or banks in general, because they deal with financial audits and financial information of their clients, as well as the way that they handle their own internal accounts. So Sarbanes-Oxley applies to anything that has to do with financial audits or financial information in general. So, and it requires IT controls testing to protect financial reporting integrity. Then we have ISO 27001 and 002 that has to do with information security management systems. So security management systems in general that hold information is what this applies to, which is, again, pretty much applying to every company that has a digital infrastructure for handling data. So ISMS is known as Information Security Management Systems, and those have to abide by these ISO International Standard for Organization. I want to say that completely slipped my mind. Sometimes I have brain farts with these things, but standard for international. Oh my god, I'm having like a problem with this now. I'm probably not going to be able to let it go until I figure it out. But so this provides a framework for risk-based security assessments, and this has to do again with information security and anything that has to do with, how at risk are we to lose access to our information? How at risk are we to lose access to our information systems? And how likely is it that a hazard can attack us, or a hazard can actually go off that will make our information systems crash, and then the likelihood of that hazard going off, or the likelihood of that hazard actually taking place, equates to risk, the level of risk that we are at when it comes down to these systems and this data. So ISO, again, these specific standards most likely will apply to every single company or organization that actually has information that they need to secure, and they have management systems or some kind of security systems, digital infrastructure that is holding that information, and now they need to abide by these standards. NIST 800-115 has to do with U.S. government security assessments. There's also another thing called FISMA that also has to do with Federal Information Security Management. So these two are very similar. They kind of go hand in hand. U.S. government security assessments defines penetration testing methodologies that are used by federal agencies and the contractors that interact with those agencies. And then FISMA has to do with U.S. government and contractors and requires security testing to protect federal data. So these two pretty much go hand in hand. They're kind of two sides of the same coin. And usually, if you're dealing with an entity that has to abide by FISMA, they also have to abide by NIST, which is the National Institute for Standards of Technology, and their framework or their standard compliance regulation for U.S. government security assessments that is called 800-115. And then we have the CMMC, the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification that has to do with defense contractors that enforces strict security controls for the Department of Defense contractors and essentially any third party that interacts and does business with the Department of Defense. And then we have the MITRE ATT&CK Framework, which is a very powerful framework that we've referenced a lot when talking about defensive security, and it's mainly used for threat modeling. The MITRE ATT&CK, and we'll be talking about it and we'll go in depth into it. There's already several videos on this channel that have to do with the MITRE ATT&CK framework, but it pretty much has to do with live campaigns. It's a knowledge base of real world attacks that have taken place, and we can use that knowledge base to simulate realistic threats. And you can find an adversary group, and basically follow along every step that that adversary group took to exercise, or not exercise, to demonstrate, what's the word that I'm looking for? Why am I having so many brain farts? Execute, that's the word I'm looking for. To execute their attack against whoever their target was. And so you see a step by step of the tactics and the techniques that they used to execute their attack, and whether or not they were successful. And more likely, even if they were caught in some capacity or at some point, all of those things are still going to be documented inside of the MITRE ATT&CK framework if it's of note. And the stuff that goes inside of this knowledge base has to do with really big attacks that were taken or that were done by certain countries against other countries, or against publicly traded companies, that caused a lot of damage or had the potential to cause a lot of damage, and got far enough that they actually got into their systems. So it's more than just the initial access that they were able to gain. They were actually able to maneuver towards their objectives, whatever their actions were that they wanted to take. They were actually able to either pull it off completely and they were never caught and then ultimately was documented, or they were able to get really, really close and they were caught, and all of those things were documented, and they were against really big targets like publicly traded companies, Fortune 500 companies, or countries. Like they attack certain countries. So the MITRE ATT&CK framework is a really, really powerful resource, and we already have videos on it, and we'll be talking about it. All right, time to talk about the rules of engagement, also known as the ROE. And these are the predefined agreements and boundaries and constraints, basically everything that you can and cannot do when you're running the penetration test, when you are running through the engagement. And the rules of engagement is actually a document. So this is established obviously through the pre-engagement activities. This is done with everybody that's going to be involved on the offensive security team, on the defensive security team, on the engineering teams. It's going to involve the C-suite executives, or at the very least, the people on the C-suite that have to do with this type of exercise. It'll involve stakeholders, it'll involve management, it'll involve subject matter experts. Everybody's going to come together at this big round table type of a meeting where they're going to say, okay, these are the rules. This is what we can and cannot do. And everybody has to abide by these rules. If you do not abide by these rules, there are a lot of repercussions that can take place, including but not limited to, people can lose their jobs, we can be fined, we can lose data, we can be sued. There's a lot of stuff that can take place if we don't follow these rules of engagement to the T. So these are not should be followed types of rules, these are must be followed types of rules, and you have to abide by them. In many cases, the rules of engagement don't include inclusions, or they don't have, these are the things that you should attack or you can attack. They include exclusions, meaning you can basically attack everything except these systems, except these range of IP addresses, these segments of our network. So these are the systems that should not be tested due to operational risk. If they are tested and if something happens and these things go down, we're going to lose money because the system will not be able to operate. We have the production versus non-production systems. So testing in live environments can disrupt operations. So sandbox environments are preferred, which essentially is you make a duplicate of this production environment, and it's considered a sandbox environment, which is a military term that is when you want to do a simulation or some kind of a rehearsed attack and you want to practice as if you're literally in that specific environment, except you're not using live rounds where you could kill the people that are inside of your test, but you will blank rounds, right? Or some kind of a paintball gun example is like a silly example. Obviously, you realize that I've never done that in the military sense, but it's like it's as close as you can get to the real thing without actually destroying a building or killing somebody in the exercise, right? So this is what that term comes from, and pretty much the same thing inside of cybersecurity, right? Inside of any kind of security entity, really, you want to have a duplicated version of the production environment, or as close to the duplicate version of the production environment, the live environment, so that you can simulate all the attacks, you can emulate all the attacks, do everything that you would do without affecting the business itself and the operations of the business. Then we have third-party dependencies, which is a very frequent case. It's a very common case. So if you have external vendors that you deal with, that they manage certain systems or certain parts of your procedures, penetration testing may require additional approvals from those people, especially if you're going to be testing their systems, right? So you say, hey, listen, one of the examples, there's like multiple examples of this that that I cover inside of the Security Plus playlist. So if you've never seen the Security Plus playlist, or if you've never gone through Security Plus training, I would recommend going through that. Even if you've gone through Security Plus training, I would still recommend going through that, because at the end of every section, I cover real world stories, actual stories that have taken place against massive companies. And one of the big ones, I think it was either Target or Walmart. It was like one of these big shopping type businesses that their third party vendor was dealing with. It was like some kind of third party vendor that was installing, I think, their air systems, like their air conditioning system, something like that. And as a result of that, they had access to the login systems of Target, and the third party company was weak, so the attackers attacked the third party company, got into their systems, and then through their system they got logins to get into Target's systems, or the shopping vendor systems, and then from there they were able to access the POS system, the point of sale systems of the shopping company, and stole a bunch of credit card information. And it was massive lawsuits that took place. It was a class action. It was hundreds of millions of dollars in fines that were paid out. And so these are really, really big deals. So testing your third party or anybody that you're doing business with is a very important concept. And before you establish, this would be the ideal case, where it's like before you establish that relationship between your company and that third party company, there should be this thing inside of that contract that says, hey, listen, every 6 months or every year or something like that, we have a penetration test that takes place. And as a part of that penetration test, we're going to test everybody else that we do business with. So if you're not okay with that, we can't do business. Right? So you declare that in advance and you disclose it so that they're aware, and then you have no problem later on going through an actual penetration test with them. So that's all of our exclusions. And then we have the escalation process. So this is the call tree as well as the playbook that is established when you establish your engagement rules of engagement, right? So you have the emergency contact. Who do you notify if a system is actually disrupted, if a live production system is disrupted? What do we do if unauthorized access is gained during our penetration test from a malicious actor? What is the decision-making chain, right? So who do I call? And how to halt testing if it's necessary? Like, at what point do we say, okay, we need to stop the test because it's very, very crazy, right? So if we've established in advance that, hey, listen, if somebody actually accesses our systems unauthorized, if a hacker or a malicious actor accesses our systems during this test, by default, you stop the test. I don't care what's going on. I don't care what step we're on. I don't care who catches it. You stop the test. You escalate it to the highest decision maker immediately. You let them know that we've been hacked, and then we stop the test immediately. So the escalation process is also, again, a very important. All of these things are important. So it's not like one is more important than the other. They're all very, very important. And then finally, under the rules of engagement, we have the testing window, which is the time frame for testing. So when are we going to do this, basically? Between what hours and what hours? Between what days? How long do we have to complete this test? So the off hours to avoid disrupting business operations, that's usually the best time to do it, unless you actually have a sandbox environment that is a duplicate of your production environment, and then you can do it in that type of a live environment. But more likely, more often than not, you'll probably be doing it in off hours outside of business hours, so you don't have to you don't take the chance or the risk of avoiding disrupting business operations. And then we have the weekends versus working hours considerations, which is again pretty much the same thing. So it's off hours, right? So if your business is closed during the weekend, then you can use the weekend to go ahead and run your tests and your examinations. This is assuming that you don't have a 7-day-a-week business. You have a Monday to Friday, 9 to 5 kind of a business. A lot of businesses have a 24/7, 365 type of an environment, which requires that you do a duplicated version of your environment in a sandbox controlled environment so that you can go ahead and run your test. And then there's the duration and the retesting that also falls under the testing window, which means how long the test will actually last, right? So you get a week to run whatever the hell you want. You can do whatever you want. And obviously inside of these rules, including the exclusions and whatever, considering all the rules that we've established for you, these are all the things that you cannot do. and then this is how long you have to do them. And then once this time is wrapped, once this timeline is finished, you are no longer allowed to do anything. You're going to move into the report generation process. We're going to go and have our lessons learned meetings and everything after the fact. And then if we need to, we will retest. And most likely we will be retesting whether or not we need to. Penetration testing in general is not a one-time thing. It's something that is scheduled, and some requirements, as we already talked about, some regulations require you to do regular penetration tests because you're dealing with massively sensitive information. Now, in addition to the rules of engagement, or I would say as a part of the rules of engagement, we have something that falls under the agreement type category. So these are things like the non-disclosure agreements, the master service agreements, the terms of service, all of those things. And these are legal agreements that protect both the pen tester and the client, assuming that the pen tester is not an in-house pen tester, assuming that the company has hired a third party to do their penetration testing. So they define the roles, responsibilities, and liability limitations of the penetration tester as well as the client. So the NDA prevents the tester from disclosing sensitive data, vulnerabilities, or test results to anybody other than the client, which is like the most basic understanding. It's common courtesy. You know what I mean? It's like, if you're going to be a professional, you want to do everything without disclosing things to the competitors or to the public. And it ensures confidentiality of the client's systems, the user's data, and their intellectual property. And this is the most basic agreement that should be included with every single penetration test. Then we have the Master Service Agreement, also known as the MSA. And the MSA defines the overall relationship between the pen tester and the client. It covers billing, indemnification, liability limitations, and it's not test specific typically. It applies across multiple engagements. So, if you hire somebody to do a penetration test for you for 3 years in a row, this master service agreement will apply to every single one of those interactions and those penetration tests. You will most likely update this. And then whenever you do update it, you do need to get new signatures on it, so on and so forth. And that is also disclosed in the master service agreement, that it says, hey, listen, this is what's going to happen. And then we reserve the right to update this at any point and then have you reaffirm that you understand what's going on and sign off on it. The statement of work, also known as the SOW or SO or SOW, is the detailed document that specifies the scope, the timelines, deliverables, milestones. So essentially all of the details that we talked about at the very beginning, and it defines what is included and what is not included in the tests, right? So the statement of work, is also sometimes known as the scope of work. This is what, again, just covers everything that has been detailed and outlined so far of what they can and cannot do, where they can and cannot attack, what their timeline is, what is required of them. That is what the deliverables are. It's like, so once you've completed your test, we need this, this, and this to be delivered to us. And it's usually a report. At the very least, there's a report that says this is what we did, this is what we found, and this is how we would remediate or mitigate all of those things that we found, and the milestones that are expected of them as well, or the milestones that they hit. And they were like, during this phase, we did this and we got this far. And then from there to point C, we got this far. And then to point D, we got this far, so on and so forth. So that's the statement of work. And then finally, we have the terms of service, which defines the acceptable behavior for penetration testers, and it specifies penalties for exceeding scope or misusing data. So terms of service is something that you've probably heard of because it involves any kind of relationship that you do with a business. And it says, these are the terms. This is what we promise to do. And then this is what we expect of you as our customer. And this is no different here. So there's acceptable behavior for a penetration tester, right? You can't, as a part of, let's say you're doing a physical penetration test, you can't come and harass my employees, and you can't, attack my employee. Like, there are just certain things you can't do, right? You gotta be a professional, and within the guidelines that we've established for you, you can do whatever you want within those guidelines. And this is considered to be your acceptable behavior. And then if you don't do these things, These are the penalties for exceeding the scope or misusing data or going outside of the acceptable behavior. This is what we reserve the right to do to you. And a lot of times it's legal action, it's fines, a lot of other things that can be pretty damaging to the pen tester or the penetration testing company. The target selection, so this falls under scope. This is kind of a little bit more of a detailed breakdown of what it means to define the scope. And that means to select your target. So it can target, or the pen test itself can target different types of networked assets. And this could be a domain name, it could be a range of IP addresses or cloud resources. And for example, we have the classless interdomain routing, also known as CIDR ranges. And this is why we said as a part of the prerequisites that it's good for you to know basic networking concepts, because this is a networking concept. If you don't know what this means, you're going to have a tough time wrapping your head around this. So the CIDR ranges, it defines which IP ranges are a part of the test. So an example would be the 192.168.1 subnet, and then the 0 element right here, implied also by the 24, the /24 that you see right here. This is telling you what subnet exists. So the 24 refers to these 3 octets. Each one of these things between each dot right here represents an octet. So if you have 3 octets, 3 times 24, or 3 times 8, excuse me, represents 24. So that would be 8 bits. That 3 times 8 would be 24, right? So if you have /24, that means this portion is the network. It's the subnet of the network. And then all of the IP addresses will be assigned to this. So for example, this would be anything from this subnet 0.1 to 0.254, because you have a total of 256 IP addresses. The 0 and the 255 would not be included in the actual IPs that are assigned to devices. Usually 1 is actually the one, 0.1 right here, or 0.1 right here, is typically assigned to the gateway, and then 255 would be the broadcast address. So typically the gateway is also considered to be one of the IP addresses, but it can go from 1.0, which is this piece that we see right here. So it can go from 1.0 to 1.255 technically, but usually at least one of those addresses is reserved for the default gateway, which will be your router, and then 255 would be the broadcast address that would be used by the devices to send out data. So this would be a range, right? This is technically a range of IP addresses that you can attack inside of the penetration test. If you don't know what this means, if you don't know what a subnet is or any of those things, I highly recommend you go to the Network Plus playlist and you find the video that talks about IP ranges and subnets and things like that, which is actually, I think, the first video in the playlist. So you go through that, and at the very least, you have a basic understanding of networking concepts, for example, a subnet and IP ranges. And then we have domains and URLs, and domains and URLs are basically this example.com is the name that is assigned to an IP address. So every domain name actually does have an IP address, but for people, it's much easier to remember google.com than it is to remember the IP address that's assigned to google.com. And then the next part of it is that for security, Google will alternate the IP addresses. They rotate their IP addresses that are assigned to their domains for security purposes, because they get attacked all the time, right? There's people that are trying to constantly hack Google and steal data or put them at ransom, whatever it is. So as a security measure, Google will go ahead and change and alternate their IP address, but you don't see that. All you see is google.com, because that's what you refer to. So a lot of times, more often than not, domains are actually included as well as the IP addresses that are included. And it could be number one, the main domain, which is example.com, right? And then you could have subdomains, which is mail.example.com, api.example.com. And then, of course, it also covers the directories after the fact. So example.com / I don't know, Google, whatever. All of those things are also included. So it's the full range of domains and URLs that are available inside of a given environment. And we'll be using various tools to enumerate the domain names as well as enumerating IP addresses that are inside of a given network. And then we will look for different ways to find the versions of the servers that are being used or the versions of the systems that are being used for these different environments, and if finding vulnerabilities for them and then finding different ways to attack them, so on and so forth. That's the whole concept of pen testing, obviously. So these are just a few of the targets that we have here, and then we have the actual IP address, the specific IP address itself that would be a target for testing. So what we talked about previously was a range of IP addresses, but there could be a specific IP address that the client wants you to test. And this would be a very important thing for organizations that have multiple data centers and cloud services. So the subnet that we talked about earlier, they could have multiple subnets that are assigned to each data center, and then within that data center there's a given subnet with a given range of IP addresses. So you'll most likely see that end up being a thing as well, where you will have subnets that are dedicated to different locations, and then subnets that are dedicated to cloud services, or IP addresses that are dedicated to cloud services. And as a part of that, you're going to add that to your scope as you add your target list, and then you'll start attacking those range of IP addresses. Now, depending on the client and the type of environment that they run, the type of devices they use, the type of services they use, so on and so forth, the industry that they're in, the assessment type will most likely vary for each client that you deal with. And they also have like unique rules and terms of service, so on and so forth, that you will have to abide by. So for the most part, they fall into one of 6 categories or 6 types, as we can see over here, right? So there's the web category or the web type, which has to do with websites and web applications. And the tools that we would use for that would be Burp Suite, the OWASP Zap tool, SQL map, things along those lines. If you have a client that is a network-based client or a network type client, then you have the internal and the external network of that client, which will be your targets, and then your tools would be Nmap, Metasploit, CrackMap, Exec, etc. If they have mobile devices that they will end up using in their environment, then you have the Android and iOS applications that are used as the targets themselves, and then we have MobSF, Frida, Drozer, and these would be the tools that would be used to penetration test those types of devices. Then we have the cloud type environment or the cloud type client, which uses AWS, Amazon Web Services, Azure through Microsoft, Google Cloud, and then you can use Pacu or Prowler or Scout Suite as your tools for that pen test. There are API types of targets, and these could be REST APIs or RESTful APIs. There's also GraphQL APIs, and you can use Postman, Burp Suite again, or OWASP Zap again as your tools for that pen test. And then we have the wireless type of client, which is the Wi-Fi network in general, which will be the target. And then you have Aircrack NG, Wiggle, and Wi-Fi Pumpkin. And you probably have already kind of connected the dots that most likely the client will have a website. They'll most likely have internal network devices and internal network IP ranges. Most likely they're going to be integrated with some kind of a cloud service. If they have a website, most likely they have an API. They probably have Wi-Fi networks. So it's like these are the types technically, but it doesn't mean that it's a specific client that only has one type. It's like there's specific types of assessments that you would run for that same client. And based on the type of assessment that you're running, you would be using a variety of different tools towards a variety of different targets. And you may be contracted to just attack their website, right? That would be the thing where it's like, I don't want you to do anything else. I just want you to attack my website, and I want you to find any vulnerability that has to do with my website or my web application. And that's pretty much it. And so this could be the thing. And then you could be contracted to go ahead and attack the whole thing, right? Attack the entire business. You have free reign on everything, as long as you obviously don't crash my business and you don't affect my network environment or my production environment and put me out of business and cost me money. You're pretty much allowed to attack whatever you want inside of the business. And that also includes people, right? So a physical penetration test is actually a thing. Like tailgating one of the customers or one of the employees tailgating one of the employees as they walk into the building, because the building requires a key card to scan and get into the building, but you don't have a key card and you want to see how attentive the employees, how aware the employees are. So you're just going to tailgate them. You're going to try to follow in to see if you can just walk in, before they close the door. Or you can say, hey, can you hold the door for me? I forgot my key, something like that, right? And see if they actually hold the door open for you. And I've done that before, and it's like shocking. It's actually kind of shocking, especially if it's not an IT based company. If like they just have key cards because it's like, I don't know, a sales company or something like that. People will just let you in the door. They'll just hold the door open for you, and it's like, okay, I don't know I don't know if your boss wants to hear what you just did, right? Or maybe the boss doesn't even know, right? Because the bosses a lot of times aren't security people either. So it's like, definitely your security officer won't want to know. So yeah, these are the types of assessments that we can potentially run in any given business or for any given client. Now, the shared responsibility model is something that we talked about a lot in Security Plus, and this is a concept that will always come up as well as if you're talking about cloud computing or really anything that has to do with security. There's a concept called shared responsibility, which means that the customer has responsibilities for security, the hosting provider has responsibilities for security, the penetration tester, everybody has their own accountability that they have to meet up to, that they have to kind of work up to or live up to. And it just depends on who it is in that entire relationship that has to abide by their specific responsibilities. But it's a shared responsibility. If the customer does things that they shouldn't do, not only does it put the business at risk, but it also puts the rest of the customers at risk. And this is where the terms of service actually comes in, where it's like, hey, listen, we love you. We want to work with you. We would love to earn your business and keep your business. But if you're going to do something that's going to put the rest of our customers at risk, then we're going to let you go. We're going to close your account and you're out of here, right? So, and that's something that has happened before, and it can damage the reputation of the company if a customer is being careless. So there's a lot of things that work. Pretty much it's across the board with everybody that's involved to keep this thing alive, right? To keep this whole project going, to keep this whole business going. Everybody has to do their part. So the hosting provider could be the company that provides the physical infrastructure for your network. It could be the cloud service provider that you're renting the infrastructure as a service, and they have to provide security of the physical infrastructure, meaning their warehouse needs to be secure, right? There needs to be cameras all over the place. There needs to be security guards in place. There needs to be multiple layers of locked doors and key cards and multi-factor authentication. All of those things need to be in place to secure the physical server that you are renting from them. And then there needs to be an uptime guarantee and a denial of service or a distributed denial of service protection, meaning if and this comes in terms of redundancy. So if this also goes to the client's or customer responsibility as well, where if I'm your customer and I'm renting one server from you, you should do a decent job of explaining to me, you should probably get a backup server, Mr. Client, because in case something happens, then you don't want to lose your service. You don't want to lose your website, or the website shouldn't crash and your customers can't access your website. So as a redundancy, as a fail-safe, you should have a backup server. Now, we're going to guarantee, as the cloud service provider, we're going to guarantee you this type of an uptime, where like 99.9% of the time, we're going to guarantee uptime to you. And the way that we'll do that is we're going to have backup power supplies. We're going to have our own redundancy servers. We're going to have multiple routers that are connected to the outbound internet, multiple switches that are connected, so that you can gain access to the stuff that you need in as frequent of a situation as you possibly can. And then distributed denial of service attack also has to do with those same redundancies. So if somebody comes and attacks one server because they want to crash that server by doing a denial of service attack, then we need to have protection in place that in case that one server is taken down and service to that or access to that service is denied, right? There needs to be a redundancy, a fail-safe, a backup server that allows the clients to still be able to access the business website while we're trying to figure out what to do with the server that just got crashed, right? And then we have the security of the data center and the network isolation, which again kind of goes back to the security that is standing at the door, the cameras, the security of protecting against hurricanes, right? That's like a natural disaster. Protecting against earthquakes by not having your warehouse sitting on top of an earthquake fault line, right? These are basic things that you don't really think about, but it's like that's important, right? Like if the freaking warehouse is sitting on the beach, yeah, it's nice. But if a hurricane comes in, or if something comes in where that beachfront gets flooded, we are now screwed, right? So it can't be sitting on a beachfront simply because the fact that it's susceptible to that kind of a hazard. And then there's the other side of it. It's like if it's sitting on a beachfront, most likely humidity is really high on that beachfront. So now we are worrying about humidity eating away at our wires inside of our warehouse. And now we have to add an extra layer of making sure the humidity inside of the warehouse is low, which means we need to go get not humidifiers, but there's these things that control the humidity, right? And it's like now that it's an extra cost to the business because it costs electricity to keep these machines running to lower the humidity. So there's like so many different things that comes into play that most people don't even think about when it comes down to the security, the physical security of that infrastructure. So all of that falls under the responsibilities of the hosting provider. And then you have the customer's responsibilities. So securing their applications, the configurations of their applications, access control lists for those applications, have multi-factor authentication, make sure that the configurations that you have on your database server or on your, let's say, your S3 bucket, the Amazon Simple Storage System bucket, make sure it's not a public facing bucket. Make sure people that just from the random internet can't just go into your storage bucket and take data out of there or take your files out of there. Make sure you have proper access control lists with proper access control authorizations that have been assigned to different people. And of course, comply, right? Ensure compliance with the regulations of your industry. That has nothing to do with me, the cloud service provider. If you're in a HIPAA type of an industry, you need to ensure compliance with your industry regulations. That's not on me. I'm just giving you the access to the infrastructure and the servers. The rest of it is on you, how you protect your client's data. Obviously, we're going to make sure that nobody can hack into our servers just by hacking us, like hacking Google Cloud. We're going to make sure that we do that, our part, to make sure that our networks are secure like that. But when it comes down to the configurations of your specific service that you're renting from us, that's on you, Mr. Client, right? So these fall under the customer's responsibilities. Then there's the penetration tester responsibility. So within the context of pen testing, the penetration tester has to follow the scope and the legal agreements. They have to follow the NDA rules. They have to document their findings. They have to provide any kind of recommendation. These are the responsibilities of the penetration tester. Don't disclose anything to the public without talking to me, or period. Don't disclose anything to the public, period. That's not a part of your job. Your job is to just test my systems and my network and my environment and point out where my weak links are, and then tell me what I should do to fix these weak links. That's your job, okay? And then follow the rules of engagement, follow the scope that I've provided you, the scope of the work, right? Follow that guideline, follow all of the legal agreements that you've signed and all of the legal agreements that we have signed to keep all of our client information and the data and everything, the intellectual property, all of those things secure. There's a lot of things that are at risk here, right? There are a lot of things that could potentially go wrong if the pen tester decides to step out of the bounds of their agreements. And then finally, there's the third-party responsibility. So this kind of falls back onto the conversation of the cloud provider, the software as a service vendor, which could technically be, like Microsoft Office 365. That's software as a service. You're just renting Office 365 from Microsoft, and Microsoft now has to make sure that their software is actually secure. Google Workspace is something that you would get from Google, and Google has to make sure that they're secure. Any kind of outsourced IT team, which can also be be an outsourced penetration testing team that could technically fall under this category as well. And then they have their own responsibilities that has to do with the terms of service that they've signed, the service agreements that they've signed, so on and so forth. So it is a shared responsibility model. Everybody plays their part, and if we all do our jobs correctly, everything should be fine, right? And as our final section, we have the legal and ethical considerations, which are the responsibilities, right? That define how the pen test should actually be conducted. So these are the rules, regulations, laws, all of those things, as well as, of course, the ethical guidelines of this whole exercise. Excuse me, I'm hiccuping. And so the authorization letters, right? So formal written approval for conducting the testing. If you're a pen tester and you don't have written approval, you don't have approval. That's just a basic rule. And if you start running pen tests because just somebody said, yeah, go ahead, do it. They pat you on the back and they shake your hand, you are a fool and you're now held liable for anything that may happen against that company. So do not do it until you have formal written approval to conduct the testing. And I would even venture to say, I would go as far as in saying, make sure it's notarized, like whatever signature is on there, make sure that thing has been notarized so that you know that the actual person who has permission to do the approval did do the approval. They're required. These are required before starting any penetration test. Absolutely mandatory. If you don't have an authorization letter, don't do it. Which also goes back to the conversation. If you don't have authorization, don't start pen testing or trying to hack into somebody's system, because they will sue you. And they will submit an arrest request and you will be arrested and it will be a felony. This is not a light thing. If you try to hack somebody without their authorization, it's a felony. It's not a misdemeanor. It's a really, really big deal. So keep that in mind. Mandatory reporting requirements. So many industries require reporting certain vulnerabilities to regulatory bodies. Now, this is mandatory on the place of the penetration tester to report to the client, and it's required by the client to report to the regulatory bodies. So they have to report those vulnerabilities to the regulatory bodies. When you're establishing your contract and your overall agreement with whoever your client is, make sure that that is also disclosed, where the requirement doesn't fall on you as the contractor. The requirement falls on the client. And if possible, for you to be able to absolve yourself from that responsibility and require the client to be the one to report that to the appropriate regulatory body. The example would be a breach notification under HIPAA or the GDPR regulations. And if there has been a breach, right, that has left HIPAA or health insurance information or general data information at risk, or that information has been leaked or the systems were breached. Maybe we can't confirm that if there's been a leak, but at the very least we were breached. And so if we were breached, we have to report it to the appropriate regulatory environment or the regulatory authority. And as one last review, there are risks to you, the penetration tester, for stepping outside of the bounds of your agreements. There are legal risks. So if you operate outside of the scope, that can actually lead to criminal charges. Outside of the scope, meaning, hey, I told you that you can attack these IP addresses, and then you attacked this one IP address that was outside of the scope. I can now sue you, okay? Keep that in mind, okay? This is a very, very big deal. It is not a civil charge. It is a criminal charge. It is a felony if you do this. There are ethical risks, right? So if you exploit a vulnerability without actually fixing the vulnerability or telling the client about it, that's an ethical risk. That it doesn't necessarily lead to some kind of a criminal charge, because if the vulnerability was inside of the scope or on an asset that was inside of the scope, it's not technically a criminal charge, but it's an ethical violation, which means that once the client finds out, because they always do, once the client finds out, you now lose reputation points. You now have ruined your credibility with the rest of your clients or your future clients because you were unethical. And then there are technical risks that if you don't know what the hell you're doing, or if you do something without confirming or verifying or not creating a sandbox environment, you can actually crash their system or expose them to malware, and now their business is at risk, which is a technical risk. So these are the risks to the penetration tester, and these are extreme responsibilities of the penetration tester for them to actually be aware of these things, to abide by these things, to make it a rule for themselves to follow these things, and make sure they don't ruin their own reputation, they don't put themselves at cause of being charged with criminal violations, and obviously they don't harm their client. Which brings us to our first set of practice questions. So we have multiple choice questions, multiple response questions, and scenario-based questions. And inside of this training document, there's multiple performance-based, kind of like drag and drop or matching type questions available as well. So if you get access to this training document, you can get access to those as well. But we're going to now go through these various series of questions that we have over here. So let's jump into the slideshow for the practice questions. All right, here we go. Pre-engagement activities. Question number 1, multiple choice. Which of the following compliance standards is specifically designed to regulate the security of cardholder data? Okay, so keep that in mind. Cardholder data could be credit cards, debit cards, anything like that, right? So HIPAA would be health insurance. General data protection is a European base that has to do with just general data protection. NIST 853 has to do with government entities, right? So PCI is the payment card industry standard. So that would be the answer here, PCI DSS. Which of the following regulations focuses on protecting personally identifiable information? Select 2. So PII, the personally identifiable information. I'm going to say GDPR is definitely one of them. PCI DSS is technically personally identifiable information as well. CCPA, I completely forgot what that acronym stands for. And Sarbanes-Oxley has to do with financial auditing information, so I know it's not that one. I'm definitely going to say it's GDPR, and I want to say it's A and C. Ooh, let's see. It's A and B. Oh my gosh, CCPA. So let's find out, because I wanna remember what CCPA is. So CCPA is the California Consumer Privacy Act. Okay, all right. So the California Consumer Privacy Act grants California residents rights regarding their personal information, including the right to know, delete, opt out of the sale of their data, and businesses must comply with these rights. So that is the CCPA. Oof. Okay, all right. So GDPR, General Data Protection, and CCPA, the California Consumer Protection. All right, moving on. Multiple choice question. Which of the following is the primary purpose of defining a test window in the rules of engagement? So we have one answer here. To limit when the pen tester can start their engagement. That's true. To ensure testing occurs during approved timeframes with minimal business disruption. That's true. To allow unrestricted testing at any time. That's not true. To avoid legal liability for not. That's also not true. So I'm gonna say it's B. I think the closest one would be B. Okay, great. Which of the following must be defined in the rules of engagement before testing begins? So we have 3 questions here, or 3 answers here. The allowed and excluded targets, that's yes. Escalation procedures for discovered, yes. Time frames and test scheduling, yes. Physical security controls of the organization, that would be no. I'm going to say no. That was not outlined in anything we talked about. So I'm going to say A, B, and C. Cool. Excellent. Multiple choice here. So which type of agreement legally prevents a pen tester from disclosing confidential company information? So disclosing, right? So that's kind of the key term here. So the master services agreement is basically the rules that they would follow in every interaction, including the one that you're working with. Statement of work has to do with the rules, regulations, the scope of the data that you can attack or the systems. Terms of service has to do with the responsibilities of each side and what happens if you don't abide. Non-disclosure has to do with disclosing. So specifically, it has to do with the disclosure of the data, and you can't disclose any of the data, all right? Multiple choice question. So which of the following CIDR notations represents a subnet containing exactly 256? Okay, so exactly 256. Keep in mind. So this /24, 25, 26 is the number of bits that are assigned to the subnet. Okay, so if you have a /24, that means that all of these, so these 3 octets have actually been accounted for. If you have a /23, it would be 192.168, and then this would be not a 1. It would be a different number. I don't know the exact number. There's a subnet calculator that's like a free subnet calculator that you can use to verify this. And then 25 and 26 means that you're taking up more than these 24 bits, which means you have less than 256. So /24 would be my answer for this. And that is indeed the right answer. All right, so multiple choice. Which of the following best describes a penetration test focusing on API security, which is the application programming interfaces? So we have the testing external and internal APIs for authentication flaws, input validation, and data exposure, analyzing network traffic for unsecured endpoints, attempting to brute force passwords of back-end API services, testing mobile applications for insecure permissions. So best describing a pen test focusing on API security, I want to say it's A. The C seems. So here's the other thing, right? So if you have to convince yourself of an answer, it's most likely not that answer. So whatever the most obvious answer is that stands out to you would be the answer. And in my humble opinion, I want to say it's A, and it is A. Let's go. All right, multiple response. Now we have multiple answers here. Which of the following are common targets in a wireless penetration test? Wireless doesn't mean mobile devices, right? So it means wireless devices in general. So rogue access points. So a wireless access point that we do not have on our list of access points, right? So what is a common target? That is not necessarily a target. It's kind of like an indication that your network has been compromised. WEP/WPA encryption vulnerabilities would be a target, yes. Web server misconfigurations has nothing to, I mean, it does technically have something to do with wireless, but again, it's not like an obvious answer. And an Active Directory group policy settings also is not a direct answer to wireless. So I'm going to say it's not C or D. And for sure it's B. Rogue access point has to do with the wireless access point. So I'm going to say that's also part of the answer because we have to select two answers. So by process of elimination, I'm going to say A and B. Excellent. All right, moving on. Multiple choice. In a cloud-based pen test, who is responsible for securing the operating system of a virtual machine hosted on AWS? So this is the shared responsibility model. We're doing a cloud-based pen test, and we're securing the OS of a virtual machine hosted on AWS. So the cloud provider, pen tester, customer, security responsibilities. Okay, so it's definitely not D because there is security responsibilities. The customer, securing the operating system of a virtual machine hosted on AWS. It's kind of a tricky question because it's also the cloud provider and the pen tester and the customer. All right, so if I were to take a guess, because I would be guessing on this one, I would say it's C, but it can definitely be A, B, or C. So let's see. It is C. Okay. It's the phrasing of the question that kind of like throws me off a little bit. But if you're talking about the operating system of a virtual machine, and if you're talking about the responsibility, this is how I kind of came to the conclusion. If we're talking about securing the operating system, they're not saying the software itself, because the software would be whoever the creator of the software was. They're talking about securing that operating system that was installed on a virtual machine. And you as the customer are the one who configures the security of that operating system. Do you have a password set up for it, or can it be publicly accessible? Do you have just a password, or do you have multi-factor authentication? Do you have rules for the IP addresses that can actually access this operating system on this virtual machine? Or is it just willy-nilly, right? Anybody from any location, from any IP address could access it. So there's a lot of different ways that you can actually secure that. And we do talk about this on creating virtual private clouds. If you go through the Network Plus playlist that's on this channel, if you go through the Network Plus playlist on the practical video, which is the last video of the playlist, we actually set up a virtual private cloud through Amazon Web Services, and we talk about security groups and security rules and things like that. So all of those are configured by the customer. It's not the cloud service provider, and the pen tester is not really responsible for that. So C is the answer. Nice. What is the purpose of an authorization letter in a penetration test? So authorization letter, which is written permission for you to do this. So to provide legal consent for testing activities, that's pretty much it. To list all discovered vulnerabilities, nope. To define escalation procedures, no. To authorize social engineering, no. So to provide legal consent for the testing activities would be the answer. And multiple response, so 2 responses here. Which of the following are key ethical considerations in penetration testing? So gaining explicit written permission from before testing, that's pretty solid, yeah. Avoiding unnecessary disruption to business, that's also solid. Exploiting vulnerabilities for personal financial gain is not a consideration, or you shouldn't do that, at least. Using backdoors to maintain long-term access for security improvement, that is also not true. I'm pretty sure the client is not authorizing that. So it's A and B would be the answers. And that's it. That's all we had for section 1.1. So cool. We are officially done. And we can now move on to section 1.2, which will be in our next video. Most likely it will be in next week's video. I'm still unsure about the scheduling and distribution of these episodes, but I think it will end up being kind of like a 1 per week. So most likely if I choose to do it that way, then I will see you in next week's episode, which will be collaboration and communication. To get the PenTest Plus notes, practice questions, and to join a supportive community of like-minded people like you, consider joining the Hackaholics Anonymous membership community. We have 4 tiers: the supporter, the agent, the guardian, and the master. And each tier gets their own Discord server and early access to content. The agent, guardian, and master levels will get exclusive content like line-by-line code explanations for how to create cybersecurity and PenTest Plus scripts, like exclusive downloads that they will get. For example, the notes document for this PenTest Plus and everything that I'm using for the lectures, as well as all of the practice questions and everything else that will go along that will be made for the scripts and everything else that we're going to be doing for the PenTest Plus training series. There will be free pre-made monthly Python automations that have to do with system administration, cybersecurity defense, as well as, of course, PenTest Plus and ethical hacking. And then there's going to be monthly live streams with me every single month, plus so many other things that you would get as a part of being a member of Hackaholics Anonymous in these tiers. To join, you can simply click the link in the description below, or you can go to our homepage and click the join button there. Or you can go to youtube.com/@hankhackshackers/join, and you'll be able to join Hackaholics Anonymous.